So a brief outline of how we're going to run things today. In a moment, I'll introduce our panelists, which you can see up the top of your screen. Hopefully we've got Jess Dart, Elise, Barkley and Anna Powell. And we'll hear a little bit from them first, and then we'll hear a bit from you. So we're going to find out a bit about where you're sitting in your level of experience and understanding of the area. Then we'll open up to some questions from our panelists, firstly from me and then from everyone in the audience. At this point, during the session, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask our panelists, you can type them into the Q&A box down the bottom. So it should be at the bottom of your toolbar. It says Q&A. Type your question in there. If someone's already written something similar, upvote that question so you make sure that it gets up there, or just upvote any questions that you like the look of and you want to make sure get a run. You can also use the chat function just to type comments as we go. You know, say yay for a point you agree with, or boo for a point you disagree with, maybe write why. We want to get some engagement happening here, so please feel free to use that chat box. I believe that's all of the, we will be recording the session, which you can probably see up the top left-hand corner, and we'll be sending out that recording to everyone who signed up to the webinar. So don't worry about taking detailed notes. You can always return to the video later on. Okay, so time to introduce our panelists. First up, we have Dr. Jess Dart. Some of you may already know Jess. Jess is the founder and CEO here at Clear Horizon. She's also the author of the Place-Based Evaluation Framework and the accompanying toolkit, which was produced in 2018. It was actually co-designed with 150 stakeholders and commissioned by the Commonwealth and Queensland governments. And we do cover off on that toolkit in the course that we run, which I'll tell you a bit more about at the end of this session. We're also joined by Dr. Elise Barkley, who is a principal consultant at Clear Horizon. And Elise led the testing of the framework I just mentioned with Logan together and developed their MEL strategy. And she's still doing quite a bit of work on Logan together. All these documents are available online. You can download them from the website, and we'll also send a link out following this session for those who are interested. And last but definitely not least, we have Anna Powell. And Anna is a principal consultant here at Clear Horizon and leads one of our teams and does a lot of work in this space as well. So panelists, I'm keen to hear a little bit about how you each came to be working in this space. And I might start with you, Anna.
Thanks, Cam. Hi, everyone. Came working in systems change space, really when my origins were in international aid and development, particularly active citizenship, and started seeing that programs just weren't cutting it. Started seeing that those who were really seeking to have significant change for foreign populations, that interventions at the program level just weren't cutting through enough. We're having the same reoccurring complex issues over and over again. We then started, I guess with our field, started learning more about what would it look like to work, not just in systems, but for systems change. And that led me personally to working both nationally, but also in my own community. And setting up an early stage collective impact initiative in my own, with people in my own community, and seeing the value of that work and how hard that work is too, but in my own backyard, which became really important and has really informed the work that I do, in a state and nationally today too.
Thanks, Anna. That's great. And Elise, how about you? How did you get your start in this space?
Well, I've always had an interest in people, places and systems. So I started many years ago as a geographer, so human and physical geography. So lots of systems work there, and also had a phase of my career where I was involved in design. So I came to evaluation from a project management and a stakeholder engagement pathway. Increasingly, I always needed to do evaluation, and I didn't want to just tick the boxes. I was trying to look for participatory ways to do evaluation. And so I did a doctorate in participatory evaluation for a real life project, and just seemed to get attracted to the complex, big social justice issues. And so that's been the niche of evaluation that I've grown into. And since joining Clear Horizon 2.5 years ago, I've specialised in this niche of evaluating systems change and place-based approaches. and, you know, learning all the time, still got so much to learn. But it's a really satisfying place. It's very engaging, but it's also an opportunity to work with all these amazing change makers. So every day I turn up to work and my partners and clients are working on amazing projects. So it's really rewarding.
Thanks, Elise. Great to find out a bit more about you and also Anna through this process. You've done a lot in the last 2.5 years at Clear Horizon, that's for sure. All right, Jess, let's hear from you. How did you start off in this space?
Yeah, so my beginning in systems goes back a long way, and it really shows my age, doesn't it? So when I was about 30 years ago, I studied systems actually, because my background, believe it or not, is I was a botanist. So like Elise, a sort of a natural science background. So I studied a lot of ecology and studied soft systems methodology and checklists, what I really learned first. So I was in my early 20s when I learned that. And then I sort of moved into a technique called participatory rural appraisal, or PRA, which was an international development context. So it was using systems thinking for participatory planning. So that was the start of my career. And then I did a PhD in evaluation and came to Australia, and founded Clear Horizon. And then I became very focused on evaluation for a very long time, and very much in the space of program evaluation. So I almost left my systems stuff behind for a while and really focused on how you evaluate programs, because most of the world of evaluation lives in the land of programs. So most evaluators are more comfortable or more familiar with program evaluation. And it was only in the last, 3 or 4 years that I've sort of come back into systems again. I think that I got back involved by I think it was being invited to help evaluate a few collective impact initiatives, and not knowing, going, oh my God, the usual stuff's just not working. We're going to have to rethink this. And I guess I've been learning ever since. I find it fascinating to understand just how different it is. And I hopefully we'll get onto that in this webinar. But I'm really enjoying the learning of trying to work out how to evaluate systems change and place-based approaches. And definitely it's been a big learning curve, I think, for me and for Clear Horizon, yeah.
Thanks, Jess. That's great. And yeah, we'll definitely touch on why the usual things don't work in this space for sure in a bit. So just to get a sense of where you, the audience, are at, so we can get a bit familiar with you, Keisha's going to share a poll with you all, and we've got a couple of questions that we'd love you to respond to. So we're just going to pull that up. The first question is, on a scale from 1 to 10, how familiar are you with systems change and or place-based approaches? 1 being not so familiar, 5 being okay, and 10 being very familiar. So pop your responses in there. And once we've got them all in, we'll display the results. And there's the second question as well, on a scale from 1 to 10, how familiar are you with evaluating systems change? So the first one is, how familiar are you with the approaches in general? And the second part is, how familiar are you with evaluating systems change and place-based approaches? Give you another 10, 20 seconds for that. All right, Keisha, let's see what the results are. Okay, so a lot of people in the 5s and above, the majority are. Looks like we've got some fairly experienced people in the room in terms of the approaches in general, and then in terms of evaluation, a lot of people in that midpoint around 5, so the okay level, and a few people up the top of the scale, but the bulk down towards the less familiar. So I think that gives us good information to inform the level at which we pitch our responses, panelists. So yeah, thank you everyone for sharing where you're at in this space. We'll now dive into our questions. So the first question I have for our panelists is, what are systems change and place-based approaches in a nutshell? So Anna, I might open up to you. So how would you define systems change?
Great question, Cam. Look, the image I really like in terms of what do we mean by a system, and then we can talk about how we change or nudge the system. The image I like is of the two fish in water, and where one fish asks the other, what is water? So this idea that we are all a system as individuals, and we're also all part of a system. And sometimes we are always so in the system, so much that it's hard to understand the complexity and exactly what we're in. It feels normal. So by definition, and Danella Meadows offers a really lovely, I think it's a really lovely definition around this. It's essentially a system is a set of parts that are interconnected and organised, I guess, in a pattern that produces a set of behaviours. And we see this both in the natural world, but also in society, and obviously the two come together as well. So for social systems, in terms of how we understand systems change of that, it's really about, I think, understanding the patterns that we're seeing in the water. What is the water? And I reference here the FSG Water of Systems Change article, which is really helpful, I find, to understand what are the elements of the water that are really holding these complex, entrenched challenges in place. And that article and that framework itself also really calls out both the implicit and the explicit parts of that, what we can see in terms of policies and behaviours, but really in terms of when we're talking about nudging or changing systems, it's really the work at the implicit level, what we see beneath the iceberg around mental models, power, resources, flow, sharing of information. Those are the kinds of things that when we talk about changing systems, we need to get right below the waterline for that. And also systems change is us in the system as well for that.
Great, thanks, Anna. Yeah, I like that. Both images of the iceberg, below the waterline, and also getting to know the water that we're all swimming in every day, but we don't see the elements of. Great. Elise, how would you define, or what's your favorite definition for place-based approaches?
So place-based approaches usually have an element of systems change in it. And the key feature is that their focus is on a place or a particular geographic location. So place-based approaches come in different shapes and sizes, but they're usually collaborative, long-term approaches to a complex problem. So it could be trying to achieve social or environmental change. So for instance, building a thriving community, and it might be sometimes tackling long-term entrenched issues in some communities and places. There's a few characteristics about place-based approaches. They are often characterised by shared design and shared ownership of the outcomes that they're trying to achieve. So different partners coming together, focusing on the context and what's going to work in place. And there's often shared or different power relations in it, trying to bring community to the centre and be informed by the experts that live in place day to day. Usually they take a strength-based approach and they value local knowledge. So sometimes they can be really grounded at the local level, so collective impacts initiatives are an example of place-based approaches. More at the end of the spectrum where that community agency is driving the work and is at the centre. But they do come in different shapes and sizes, and people have different definitions for them as well.
Thanks, Elise. Covered a lot of ground in that definition. It's quite expansive. Jess, anything that you'd like to add to either of those definitions?
Yeah, I'd just like to say the thing that I always try to reinforce is that, it sounds funny, but a systems change approach is not a program approach. That's the key difference. So a program is generally all activities are being controlled by one organisation towards a set of goals. In these systems change and place-based approaches, there are multiple organisations involved, all doing their own with slightly their own agendas, but trying to come together to work towards something. I think that's one of the features. is that it's not a bound program with a tight scope, and so that presents all sorts of different issues for evaluators. But I think it's really important to get not a program. We're not talking about programs. We're talking about a change effort, if you like, across many organisations. Like, for example, Logan Together, which is very famous. It's one of the most long-standing place-based approaches in Australia. Is I think there are like 70 or 80 how many organisations are involved?
There's 150. It looked like.
Oh my God!
Yeah, framework in terms
that
of
was the stakeholders, but in terms of the number of agencies, I think it's. Do you know how many it is, Elise? It's
no, I don't have a hard number, but
yeah, this is it's 3 levels of governments. So it's local government, state government, federal government, lots of NGOs, lots of organisations, and lots of community group as well, and they're all coming together. So it's not a program, and they're generally quite long term.
Thanks, Jess. So next question, what are your top 2 challenges in this space? And let's start maybe with you, Elise.
All right, well, carrying on from what Jess was just saying about the diverse range of people and organisations involved, one of the challenges is how to reflect or how to embed the principles of place-based approach in the evaluation approach. And so how do you bring together really diverse mix of stakeholders and people to be part of the journey of evaluation and learning? It takes time, it takes resources, it needs to be culturally appropriate and safe, and it needs to be able to hold different knowledge systems as well. So yeah, the diverse stakeholders and trying to work out how to do some rebalancing of power within that mix of stakeholders is challenging. It's really good work, very challenging though. Another challenge would be that this is early days in the field for evaluating systems change. So it's an emergent part of practice and theory. And so in a sense, we're early adopters, and the systems around us as evaluators aren't often set up to support and enable the work. So even just down to really practical things about how some of the contracts are set up for the work, sometimes rigid and not supporting the adaptive work that's needed. So we're still in the early days and on the forefront of trying to set up all of the enabling conditions for us as evaluators to be able to do the work in this area.
Absolutely. It sounds like, yeah, hamstrung a little bit by the systems that are currently in place, lacking the flexibility that you need. Anna, how about you? What challenges or top 2 challenges are you encountering at the moment?
Yeah, look, I think when we talk about evaluating systems change, and that can include place-based change, that it really requires us, even as evaluators, to be thinking about this as just a strategic learning process. So if our fundamental assumption is that the system is somewhat broken, not saying some parts might be serving people well, but fundamentally our assumption would be that it's broken, that it's also complex, so we don't understand yet how to best address it. And we're actually often learning about the system itself through trying to sort of probe it. Another shout out to a framework that I love here is the conniving framework by Dave Snowden. So this idea that we're often, that the really entrenched challenges, we need to sit in that complex space. We need to work in a way that's conducive to complexity. So the idea of a set and forget program that Jess described is not going to work in this. We need to do mini experiments. We need to be probing. We need to constantly be learning. Now, that sounds all fine, but actually rewiring how we think about evaluation is really at the heart of that as well. And I've experienced and I've worked with initiatives and in initiatives where embedding strategic learning as an ongoing culture and part of how we work daily is really, really tricky, because it also requires even our funders or us as funders to be seeing ourselves as learners in that space. And it suddenly starts to shift power in a really different way, where it's not just evaluation to report upwards. this goes to my second challenge, it's also about rethinking accountability, that learning happens in all directions, upwards, sidewards, and downwards for this. So really at the heart of that, and to get to embedding strategic learning in a systems change work requires a whole lot of trust between all the parties. That takes a lot of time to build. It takes a long time and continual work on readiness to do systems change and to really step into the hard space of, if we're learning, that's about as self, as initiative, and of the system. It's the three levels of it. And of course, then that brings in questions of, power dynamics that we're used to sitting in and how we might shift that so that we can really all be co-learners of the system and of our efforts to change that. I could go on, but they're really interesting challenges for us as evaluators in how we show up in that work too.
Power's come up several times now. Both you and Elise have mentioned it, so we definitely have to make sure we return to that. I want to give Jess a chance to respond to the question, and then we'll get back there. So Jess, what are the top two challenges that you are encountering?
And I really echo everything that Anna and Elise have said. It's sort of a really interesting space to work in. It is turning a lot of things on its head. I want to just come back to the technical side of it, though. I'm going to be technical now, like technical evaluator, and tell you a few challenges from that perspective. So at first, it's a basic concept, but number one, these things are long-term, right? So I was reading a book, and I will put a link to this, called The Impact of Collective Impact, and it looked at 24 collective impact initiatives in America and Canada. And the average one was 9 years to get, 9 years was the earliest really before you started to see population level change. So these things are long-term. There is now evidence that they are pretty effective, which is, I guess, why we're all so excited. But the problem is it takes a long time. Now, with that problem comes the challenge of what Mark Cabbage calls expectations failure. No matter how much you tell people you're not going to see any population level change for at least 9 years, nobody seems to believe me. I keep telling people you're not going to see any change yet. And this requires us to manage that challenge. So one, and we'll talk about how, but it doesn't seem to matter how much you tell people that you won't get it. It still keeps coming back that funders are expecting to see population level change sooner. So we have to break that down into the sorts of change we might see earlier on, because there's a lot of change that goes on sooner, but it's not where you expect it to be. So that's first, what we value as change, what we'll accept as progress in the early years is a really big challenge. That's the first one. The second one is, as well as being long-term, both Anna and Elise have hinted at this, they're also very complex, okay? So, you might do something here and it goes, it splurges another problem over there. So it's sort of like it's not knowable in the sense that things like results-based accountability that are so popular at the moment, they don't work very well. Why? Because the premise of results-based accountability is that you can plan what you're going to do and what will happen. So you go, okay, these are the incremental targets that we can set over time and we'll see whether we've hit them. No, that doesn't work at all, because we've no idea what we're going to achieve in about a year. We're aiming for this long-term thing. And you know what? We have to learn our way through change. We are going to replan and replan and replan and replan. We are not going to end up doing in a year what we thought we were going to do at the beginning. If you want to be successful, you've got to constantly adapt. So our traditional notions of setting targets and ticking them off, setting all the planning out at the beginning, it just doesn't work in this context. So we have to rethink about how we plan evaluation as well as planning the work. Yeah.
Thanks, Jess. All right. So what are your key tips? If those are the things that you're struggling with, how are you getting around them? What are your tips and the lessons that you've learnt through these hard-won battles? We might start with Anna.
Thanks, Cam. Look, I think if one of the challenges is how do we embed strategic learning at the core of what we do and how we practice. The assumption behind that is that there's sufficient trust within the collaborators to be able to, as Mark Cabbage calls, fail forward to be able to actually learn about what's working and not working. So if we're talking about trust, that's bringing us into, things that, approaches to leadership. It talks about our culture, how we're setting ourselves up often as a collaboration before we're even really talking about the work we're doing externally. So that's one tip. And I've finding over the last few years in particular that as evaluators, we're called in earlier, which is great. And we're often called in to play the role of a developmental evaluator. And in that role, we can sit with 1 foot in, 1 foot out, and it really supports the collaboration, which we're sometimes a part of, to be really thinking and working on building our muscle and working out how our DNA and how we work at our culture as a collaboration that we want to sort of model and set up before we can do the work externally. So sometimes very practically that looks like having at least a year of design before any types of initiatives and prototypes are put out, and doing that work as a nucleus strongly too. And yeah, I have seen really the value that developmental evaluation can take in that, because it becomes an evidence-based approach to really doing that iterative work. And there's the value of having someone or people with roles with 1 foot in, 1 foot out to kind of hold that mirror back, help people step out, on top of the tree rather than in the roots of the work. All those kinds of things that can really help set the collaboration up to do systems change, because the trap again is that it falls back into programmatic work instead of getting below that iceberg. Yeah, it's probably enough images.
So many metaphors and images. Holding up the mirror, the icebergs, the oceans.
There's a beautiful picture coming.
Yeah. And how about power? Because you did touch on power earlier. What are you doing day to day to manage those dynamics?
Look, there's work I'm really interested in understanding power and role at an individual level and at a system level. So where I think we could start to bring some more work in is, drawing from the adaptive leadership field in that as well, getting more comfortable to actually be using the word power for people, and ourselves included, to understand the authority and the rank that we each bring and the different types of power that everyone in the collaboration brings, how we harness that well, also how we share power. So practically, that looks like starting with conversations and it being okay to talk about the P word, and then can also, technically involve some self-assessment tools that can then become basis for reflection of how we work with power well. And of course, we can track that and evaluate that as well.
I know you're a fan of Julie Diamond's work on power, and she has an index for power to help you measure, how power is being used or wielded well or not so well. So that's a resource out there that people can draw on.
Yeah, good one.
Thanks, Elise. Sorry, getting confused with my panelists. Sorry, Anna. Thank you. Elise, how about you? What are your tips? Top 2 tips.
All right, so I think there is the technical side of things, and I think it's really important to also appreciate the cultural side of evaluating in systems change. And often there's this shared approach to measurement, and so you've got multiple organisations sharing data and collecting data, trying to create a picture of the changes that they're contributing towards. And so with this shared approach to measurement that we're seeing as a feature in this space, there is a culture that is supporting that, and the culture of learning is really important. And so, as Anna pointed to, in order to promote innovation and to develop the trust to be able to share data that often might not have been accessible to all parties, the culture is really important. And being able to use in a timely way learning, so not just once a year evaluation data, but to be able to get cycles, shorter cycles of strategic learning that builds that culture is really important. Another practical tip that I would offer is setting agreed principles. And so referring to that power theme that you were asking about, Cam, a principle of data sovereignty for community ownership over data and how they get to tell their story of change could be a principle that then shapes how the work's done. But we find that principles for the work itself and also evaluation of the work is really good. Actually, I've got one more. Zoom in and zoom out, because as Jess said, progress is multi-dimensional and can be 2 steps forward, 1 step sideways. It can be about the conditions of, creating the conditions for the longer term change, as well as the changes that are the big goals. Like it might be the long term goal is improving lives for kids and families in a particular area. But it's not an A to B, how far along are we towards our destination type of progress measurement. So you have to chunk it out and see the multifaceted, multidimensional nature of it, and try and define for each phase of the longer term work what progress and success is reasonable and sufficient for that phase across the different dimensions of it. So it takes a bit of zooming out to see the whole systems, and then zooming in on phase relevant or little domains within, because you can't evaluate everything. There are so many different moving parts, so you need to prioritise and just do the vital few that are relevant for that phase.
Thanks, Elise. So yeah, that ability to get up on the balcony like they talk about in adaptive leadership sounds like it's a crucial skill. It's really interesting hearing you talk culture, power, trust, adaptive leadership. You're really working with soft skills, as they call them in inverted commas. I don't like that term, but people skills, being really, tuned in and sensitive to what's happening in groups, in people, and in a system, unsurprisingly. So it's a whole new set of skills that evaluators need to develop. I mean, we have some of these, but that's a very broad toolkit that you need to draw on. So Jess, how about you? What are your top 2 tips?
Yeah, and it's not just the soft skills to draw on. We draw on the soft skills a lot, but the technical skills get pretty advanced as well. The technical evaluation skills required are there all the time. This isn't evaluation light in any way, is it? So at the same time as managing power and relationships and stakeholders and emergence, you're also, have to draw on a lot of technical evaluation methodologies too. So when I talked about long-term change, one of the techniques that we find really useful is to develop a big picture theory of change, a big picture theory of change that gets an understanding about how change is expected to happen. And unlike a program sort of level theory of change, the ones we've been developing are what Elise referred to as being phased. So a phased theory of change, what does that mean? You've basically got a different theory of change for the early years, the middle years, and the later years. So the first 3 years, you might be trying to build the conditions for this work, and that's what success looks like. And then when you move past that in the middle years, you might start to see some changes in things like funding flows and behaviours and conversations and mindsets. And that's what you're going to be looking for, and that's what you're going to be evaluating. And it's not really till the end that you're likely to see actual many changes for families and people for the sort of impact level. Mind you might want to set the baseline at the beginning. It doesn't mean to say you're not looking at all of it concurrently, but you phasing it out is really helpful, which Elise was talking about. But we use theory of change methodology to do that. It's sort of almost like a systems level theory of change. And that can really help manage expectations and actually show concrete progress. Everybody needs to understand what's expected at different phases. So that's one of the ways we're learning about managing expectations and results and progress. The other thing I talked about was emergence. So systems change and place-based approaches kick up lots of unexpected outcomes. Like you might make an improvement over here, it's possible that you're making something worse over there. So you have to keep your eyes open at the whole thing. So that requires a very different type of evaluation methods. So practically we need techniques that are capable of capturing and making sense of unexpected outcomes. So not just, have we done this, have we done that? So the idea of like setting a target and seeing whether you've met it is not enough. You know, you need to use what I would call methodologies that can capture a broad range of things. So it's like, I imagine like throw a net out into the sea, pull it in, and have a look at what fish you've caught and work out which ones you need, you know, what's going on, and then zero in. So the methodologies that are good for that are things like outcomes harvesting, most significant change technique. We've been using a technique called, well, we developed a technique called SIPSI, which is significant instances of policy and systems change, and their case study approaches, and they explore and delve in. And then when it comes to trying to work out whether it had anything to do with what you do, we move into contribution analysis. We start looking at, well, what role did we play? What did others play? How does that fit together? So it's methodologies. There's a whole new sort of era of methodologies that are cropping up that we're beginning to use. But a lot of them are story-based, they're qualitative, they're capable of capturing and making sense of emergence.
Hey Jess, I might just plug the toolkit for the place-based evaluation framework. So it was released in 2018, still really holds strong. There's about 80 different methods in the place-based evaluation toolkit, and it's been categorized so the methods are grouped around the different theory of change approach that Jess was saying. So methods that are good for understanding systems types changes, methods that are good for the population level changes. But it's a really good resource, and it has a really diverse dilly bag of options in there.
And it's free, of course.
Thanks for chipping in there, Elise. I've dropped that into the chat room, chat box, so you can access that when you need. Great. So another quick question. I know that Anna has to leave a little bit early in 5 minutes time. So just a quick question around who should be involved in doing this evaluation of place-based approaches and system change approaches. And feel free, maybe Anna, because I know you've got to leave soon, if you want to kick us off.
Well, yeah, and this kind of is something relates to what I'm wrestling with too, which is really around how we build capability to do this. As Elise mentioned, we are on the cusp of how do we evaluate systems and place-based change. And so we are learning, and we're learning alongside initiatives and communities. So we have capability building piece, and there's also field building, and particularly to your point and question here, Cam, is who we need to involve. Community has to be at the heart of this. This has to be of value to the community ultimately. And how do we do this in a way that I've been reflecting on this conversation we've been having? How do we have these conversations in a way and engage, community where it's not just the consultants that are flying in and doing the evaluation and flying back out. And there are ways we're doing that, but that's still something that I'm wrestling with. We all are wrestling with is how do we really meaningfully not just engage, but have community driving what's setting of value and setting of data and setting of learning as well. So.
What have you learnt so far about what works in that regard? Maybe an example that you can give.
Yeah, there's an initiative. This is more of a systems change initiative rather than place-based change. So it's not geographically defined, and it's in the education sector. And with the Menzies Foundation. So we're really looking at how do we engage people who are on the coalface, people within schools, and ultimately young people, in determining what change looks like to them, and then building their capacities, giving them skills and tools in how do they actually also gather the data and use it. And they're not just the technical skills either. It's not just his data collection plan and some tools. We're really investing in their capability, the adaptive capability of them to work in complexity. And essentially in time, that they become co-researchers with the Menzies Foundation in that as well. So that's one way.
That's incredibly exciting.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Capacity building of the people in the community to do the work themselves.
And look, and kudos to Menzies Foundation that, because it's a long-term project and they're investing in that for the long term, and that's what it really takes, is to slow the whole thing down. Well, we see it slowing down, but actually it's enabling the work to happen where it needs
Slowing
to
down
happen.
to speed up.
That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about you, or Elise or Jess? What some examples of how you've, I guess, empowered the community to do this work for themselves?
Well, there's building in capability building along the way, and co-designing and co-facilitating. There's also approaches. Jess coined co-evaluation we did with a collective impact with the Hive and Together in Wilmot in New South Wales, where there was a really large share of ownership from the collaborators around collecting the data, bringing it together and doing shared sense making. So we supported them and had an independent eye over it, and was able to help them with verification and a final report. But they really held and owned the data collection and analysis process. And we're also seeing some really exciting things happen for some government agencies that we work with. And so there are some agencies at Commonwealth and state levels who are seeing evaluation really differently. So rather than that the community is meant to report to government, they're asking themselves, how are we showing up? Are we showing up as enablers? Are we being a barrier? How are we contributing to the work, and to what extent are we helping the community reach their own agenda? And so they're evaluating themselves. So it's becoming more of a 360-degree view. And so in some ways, the stakeholders involved may still be similar to 5 years ago, but the questions that they ask themselves and the role that they acknowledge that they play in the system has shifted. And so that's really exciting. It's about how people are showing up to evaluation and the work.
Yeah, it's exciting. And it builds on many, I'd just like to say, it builds on many years of participatory evaluation. That is not new in international development, and in many sectors communities have been involved in doing participatory evaluation. But I feel like there's a new era coming. I'm hopeful that there's a new era, and that new era will be co-evaluation, which is more than participatory evaluation, I believe, and it'll be more led by communities using tools that they decide are useful and relevant for them. And I think that there's some place in this for the sort of story work, such as Most Significant Change has always been valued by communities for many years. Since it came out in 2005, it's been used by communities directly, and it's been found valuable. But I think there's also an element of bringing, data sovereignty and communities working with quantitative data as well. And it's this numbers and stories that come together that can be really can sit really comfortably in the hands of community. And there's something, I think that'll be the next frontier. Personally, I'm quite excited to see what the next few years brings. I think the field is changing, and it's about time, because evaluation is part of the problem, you see. This is the awful truth, isn't it? It's when you realise that you're part of the problem too, that our field has been part of the problem. It has been, it has been holding problems in place, and we've got a role to play to step up and think about our field and how it needs to transform. Yeah.
And I might just emphasise, Jess, that a part of that in our context in Australia is decolonising evaluation, and as evaluators learning to, a new frontier of learning for non-First Nations evaluators of how to hold traditional ways of knowing and being and doing with traditionally, a white lens of evaluation that's come into the field. So it's really timely that we forge forward with that.
Absolutely. I know Anna now has to leave.
Bye-bye, Anna.
Thanks so much for joining us, Anna. Right. So I wanted to come back to you, Jess. You mentioned something interesting there. I know you've been thinking about this stuff for a very long time. So with that experience, where do you see the field heading in the future? Where are we moving towards?
Well, I mean, this is what I want. I am always very, like, I have an optimistic view of, you know, I want the future to be what I want it to be, really. But I believe that we're just beginning to learn about decolonizing evaluation and really beginning to question the role of the evaluation and whose values counts. Like in evaluation, you make judgments, yeah, of merit and worth. So whose values are they based on? And I think I feel like there's been a big, over the last 10 years, there's been a big upsurge all over the world in co-design methodologies, yeah? So co-design, everybody's talking about co-design and the way communities are playing a bigger role in designing, you know, interventions and things. Well, I think the next wave will be co-evaluation, where the evaluation is put more into the hands of people. That's what I'd like. And that we're all going to have to work on how that is. And I don't think it's going to go away. I know, you know, I read a lot of science fiction, so you have to forgive me. But, you know, the robots are here. Like, so, like, you know, a lot of the things that we're data and information, some of it's going to be automated. So the world's changing very fast in the world. In our world of evaluation is under a huge amount of change. But I think this need to make sense and learn to deal with the softer side of evaluation and adaptation and power, and our role are just going to be so critical going forward, and the robots aren't going to help us with that. So there's still going to be lots for us to do there.
Sounds like we might be needing to create courses in soft skills perhaps at the Academy.
I think there's a lot of soft skills stuff that's going to be needed, yeah.
As well as
not just evaluation. That might be all of us in Australia, hey? Yeah.
For sure. So I think now we can break open to some questions from our audience. And the top question we've got here is from Kiri Dicker, and she asks, how important do you think it is to map the system you are trying to influence as part of the evaluation approach? And if you had a client who had a low appetite for complexity, how would you get them started on mapping the system without overwhelming them? So who'd like to take us off there?
I've got a feeling Elise and I might have different views on this, and there's probably no right answer, but I'll start with mine and then Elise can offer hers. So like, I actually don't use systems mapping that much when I'm doing evaluation, setting up an evaluation framework, but I do use a systems approach to theory of change. So in a way I do, but I find the systems mapping thing the systems mapping gets so complex that people do use that. But for an evaluation lens, I find it more helpful to develop what I call a global theory of change. So a global theory of change is where you map out what the system would look like, what is your desire, what the desired outcomes are at a number of different levels. So desired outcomes for like population level outcomes, desired outcomes for what the system needs to be doing differently, in order to deliver on those outcomes, and also the conditions, the three levels, the conditions, the systems, population level. And that's enough, a complexity. I don't go much further than that, but that's just the way I've been practicing it. What do you think, Elise?
Well, I also don't use systems mapping as an evaluator. Often our partners that we work with, they use it as a tool in order to inform where they make decisions around where they want to put their efforts. So what parts of people's behaviour or relationships that they're trying to change. And so some of the partners that we work with have already got systems mapped out. And so they can help us as evaluators. But coming in as an evaluator, I haven't actually worked with clients to map before we do it. And so usually they're clear on where they're trying to work. And so then it's helping define within a certain review period, well, what would good look like for that area of systems change that you're going after. And so there might be a few domains that we prioritise areas of change. So it might be looking for policy changes if they're trying to use advocacy and policy influence. It might be behaviours or the way that people are thinking or understanding things in the system. It might be relationships or ways people are working together. So yeah, I work with people to articulate a few of those points and then look at how we can try and measure and get some information about that.
And I remember when I used to work in the natural science area, and we do theory of change there too, it would be that you do conceptual models of ecological flows, of how water flows and how, you know, ecological webs and things, which would be systems mapping. You do all of that sort of work before, and that was more in the diagnosis and the work of thinking about how to do the systems change work. And it was the theory of change. That's when the evaluators got involved, really. It was like, okay, that's what you're trying to do. What would good look like, and how do we measure that? So I think that maybe it is important to do systems mapping, but it's not necessarily the piece that the evaluators use. It's the piece that the implementers use. Does that make sense? Yeah.
It can help a rating of significance for us as well. You know, like if we can understand the bigger picture, and it helps us interpret the changes and the significance that they have on the whole thing.
We use it all the way through, really, but it's not the core. It's like a systems awareness is definitely required there. Yeah. Cam?
Great distinction. Thank you for clarifying that, Elise and Jess. So what are the common mistakes people make when they're starting out, either implementing or evaluating a place-based approach?
Shall I go, or do you want to go?
You go.
Oh, well, the first thing I see is that people are really interested in population level change. So they spend ages mapping out the what it is that they want children to, you know, what are the things holding problems in place for kids. Say if you want kids to thrive by 5 or complete school or do well, they spend ages up at that level thinking about, you know, what are the predeterminants for health and how do we measure them, and they get really technical about their measurement, and they get that text that's so huge, they get bogged down in that, and they actually don't look at the conditions. They don't look at the systems change, and the systems change and the conditions change first, so that they're basically focusing on stuff that's not going to change for a really long time, and then it doesn't change, and then they don't know what they're doing is working or not, and they're stuck. And I see that as a really common mistake. And it's not that that work isn't important, it's super important. It's just that unfortunately change is not linear. It's not like you go a little bit of change, a bit more, gradually over time. Can you see my hands sort of get in the right place? It's not like that. It's like nothing, something. It's like the change is not gradual. The trajectory of change doesn't work like that. And all this time where nothing looks like it's happening, there are things happening that you can measure, but you got to look elsewhere. So that's the mistake that people make, and then they're left with thinking they've achieved nothing and not knowing. They're in the dark.
A little bit like COVID. You think you're fine, and then suddenly, boom, there's a spike.
Like today,
it comes out of nowhere.
in Melbourne here. Whew.
Yeah. Okay, thanks Jess and Elise, and thank you Sophie Moore for that question. Good question there. So now next question is from Janet Conti, and Janet asks, it sounds like it needs champions to be working very hard in the system to get change to happen. What happens if the champion leaves?
Yeah, I think that usually these things start off a bit organic and relational, and so sometimes change can get advanced because of an individual or a champion in that system. And so the next step after those sort of relational things are set up is to try and embed the policies or the frameworks for change into the systems, institutionalize it a little bit more so it doesn't depend on a small group of champions, and if they go then it's, you know, the work's vulnerable. But it does get phased, and it usually does start organically and relationally. What would you add, Jess?
Yeah, the hero, it doesn't really work well to have one hero that sort of leads it all. Those sorts of approaches aren't as sustainable as when it's a whole, you know, group of people taking leadership. There are many leaders. If they're really effective, systems change approaches aren't reliant on one person. You know, there's a lot of people have to take their leadership roles, and maybe that's a trap for some, is that they are too dependent on an individual. So the more mature ones, I would say, the really good leaders are leading from the back, actually. Yeah.
Which returns to that capacity building piece we're talking about, and community empowerment. Ideally, you have a community of leaders leading the thing rather than...
That's right. That's where it starts to work.
I heard a nice analogy from Kerry Graham at Collaboration for Impact, and the analogy was that it's like a choir, that one person in a choir, if they need to, can take a breath, and the music keeps going, the song keeps going because of the support of the many. And I liked that one.
That was a good metaphor. We're cracking out the metaphors today. Loving it. All right. So this is a question from Jeff. Jeff asks, who is asking evaluators to evaluate their systems? Is this currently supply or demand driven? Any examples of work in progress or completed here?
We're doing loads of work in this space. We're getting asked to do this work. So we're working for government, we're working for philanthropy, we're working for federal government, state government. We have probably, I wouldn't like to think how many projects we've got on the go at the moment, but we're being asked to help. Evaluators are being asked to step into this space. There's a big demand for the work.
And we're also working with collaborations directly, so they reach out for evaluation partners or some mentoring and support at different points along their learning journey. And so we work directly with collective impact initiatives as well that are a mix of different stakeholders.
Great. So we probably have time for one more quick question from Avigya Kaki. What advice do you have for an evaluator who needs to capture systematic change in a program-based approach? Maybe 20 seconds from each of you for that response.
I think she might mean systemic change rather than systematic, maybe.
Sorry, yeah, possibly, yeah.
Yeah. How do you capture systemic change? I mean, like qualitative methods that are open, that capture change, such as most significant change, where you ask people what are the most changes as a result of this, can dig up all sorts of this stuff. Looking at the waters for systems change, looking at the changes in relationships, changes in flows of money and power, power dynamics, mindset changes, they're often captured qualitatively. So open the net up is what I would say.
And I reckon once you've defined what progress or good looks like in those areas that Jess has said, a good tool can be a rubric. So to be able to put out what, different levels of performance and be able to have a tool to rate against as an evaluation tool is really helpful.
Wonderful. Look, out of time, unfortunately. I can see there's lots of questions still unanswered. Apologies for that. We did our best, but great that we had so much engagement and you had such great questions. I'd really like to thank all three of my panelists. Anna, who's left a bit early. Thanks to Anna. Thank you, Elise, and thank you, Jess. Some really great replies to those questions and some really thought-provoking conversation.
Thank you so much, Cam, for hosting.
Absolute pleasure. And just to wrap us up, just wanted to let you know that we, as I mentioned at the start, we are running a course on this topic, which launches at the end of next month. And we'll be sending an email out to everyone who applied, who attended this webinar with more information about the course and how you can sign up if you're interested. So thank you everyone for joining, and we will send out a recording of this to you in the next few days. All the best, and have a great weekend when you get there. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.